So we're going to take a break for 4 weeks from the book of Philippians, and then we'll pick it back up after Christmas. For the next 4 weeks, starting today, we're talking about the unexpected. How do we respond to the unexpected? So maybe if I preached this sermon on another year, I would need to kind of talk and walk you through times where you've encountered unexpected and had to respond. This year we know, right? It's a reality. And life really is a series of unexpected encounters. The first several chapters of Luke tell that story. We're going to hear 4 different stories from 4 different people, all in the first several chapters of Luke over the next 4 weeks. Today we're going to hear a story about how God met someone in their doubt and brought them to a place of worship. Next week, we're going to hear how God met someone in their confusion and took them to a place of worship. In 3 weeks, we're going to see how God met someone during their regular routine and brought them to a place of worship they never expected. And then in 4 weeks, we're going to see how some people meet some unexpected things with readiness, and how God satisfies our longings. How God satisfies the longings. So that's what we're going to be thinking through over the next 4 weeks here as we consider how we respond to the unexpected. We certainly have had unexpected things this year. Every year carries them though, right? There are things that happen in life that we just don't expect. Maybe they're not all huge things, but there are things that surprise us, that take us off guard. Ways in which God interjects in our lives in ways we didn't fully expect him to. As I was thinking through this, I thought about a time in my life, and maybe nobody else here has done this, but I've had at least one, I think twice, but I remember one clearly where I drank something and in my head I was thinking it was something different. So there was this time where I sat down, I was thinking I was going to drink this nice big glass of milk. I was reading, so I wasn't really paying attention. And so I went to drink it. And it tasted tangy and sour because it was orange juice. But in my head, I convinced myself it was milk. I don't know how I did. I just was thinking about milk, and I don't know. Maybe I'm alone. Maybe I'm just weird. But maybe some of you have experienced that too. And as I thought through this, that second, when I took the drink of what I thought was milk, I experienced flavors of tanginess I didn't expect. And my initial response was, that's wrong, right? But it wasn't wrong for orange juice, was it? It tasted exactly how orange juice should taste. The problem was I was expecting milk. And so it's not that the orange juice was wrong. It was just my expectations were misplaced. And as we think through life, there's a reality that we have a certain set of expectations, whether we readily acknowledge them or admit them or not. Some of those come from our past, our upbringing. Some of those go from the way life normally goes. Some of those come in different ways and different forms, but they become a part of the way we think. And there are times in life where God shakes up those expectations. And what we need to learn over these next 4 weeks is how to worship in the unexpected. How do we respond to these times in a way that will honor God and which we can learn the things he wants to teach us? Today we're considering doubt. It's fascinating to me that the first story of Luke is about a guy who doubts when an angel named Gabriel comes to him with a message. And he doubts it. He doesn't believe it to be possible. And the first 4 verses, as Luke works his way there, are very clearly showing this book, this letter of Luke can be trusted. Now, maybe somebody's listening today who doesn't believe in Jesus, doesn't believe the Bible is real, doesn't believe that God's word is trustworthy. Maybe you do believe in Jesus, but you just need reassurance that everything God says is true and is trustworthy. If you're in either of those positions, you're in good company. Maybe you've heard of a man named Sir William Ramsay. Some of you may have, may not have. He was an archaeologist. He was a biblical skeptic. He was an atheist. He was raised that way. He was convinced that the Bible was just full of a lot of made up stories and would be full and just riddled with errors. And so he became a professor at the University of Edinburgh. And once he achieved a certain status there, he became very outspoken against the validity of Scripture. And so he took a trip to Asia Minor to prove Luke didn't know what he was talking about. Luke wrote a 2-volume set, Luke and Acts. They're both by the same author. It's a 2-volume set. And if you've read through either of them, you know Luke is one of the most detailed writers there is, right? And so this guy was convinced, Sir William Ramsay was convinced that look at all that detail that he put in there. It'll be easy to disprove this. Just find all kinds of things he said that don't fit with archaeological evidence. So he went to prove him wrong. And after he spent some time there and did a lot of research, this is what he said. The present writer, in other words, he could have just said, I take this view, but he says the present writer takes the view that Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. At this point, we are describing what reasons and arguments changed my mind of one who began under the impression that the history was written long after the events and that it was untrustworthy as a whole. And this began a process in which Sir William Ramsay thought, okay, if he could be that accurate and then this claims to be Scripture, I need to investigate what it's talking about. And he ended up becoming a follower of Jesus soon after. And so that sets the stage for the story of a guy who doubted, right? Isn't that pretty cool how God set that up like that in his wisdom? And so it leads us into this story. This is a story of a godly couple who was living with what they thought was a void in their life, only to find out it was an opportunity for blessing. This couple's name was Zachariah and Elizabeth. Now they had an issue. Elizabeth could not give birth to children. That was a problem in that day and age especially. It's hard for any woman, but it was really a problem for them. They were looked down on, first of all. It was looked as a societal, what's wrong with you that you can't have children? Secondly, some people actually saw it as a sign of sin in your life if you couldn't have a children. That's just God's judgment on you that you can't have children. Third, it had economic implications because the kids would take care of their parents when they aged. And so here you have a couple who is aging and hadn't realized the fulfillment of something they had been praying for and desiring for a long time. That's the couple we're introduced to in this story. When did this happen? Verse 5. If you're not open to Luke chapter 1 already, this is a big text compared to what we usually do, but we're going to walk our way through most of chapter 1. We missed some verses between 26 and 56 because that's going to be our text next week with Mary. So this happened, verse 5, in the days of Herod, the king of Judah. So it tells us there was a priest named Zachariah. When it says he was a priest, you may have an image in your head of this was his job all day long. He was used to serving in the temple. That's probably not the case actually with him. It says according to the division of Abijah, it says what that's telling us is he was a part of a certain group of priests. There were 24 divisions or groupings of priests that were, I guess we would call them like laymen priests or whatever. So they had a regular day job is the point. And then they would only serve 2 weeks out of the year. And then they would go back. And so we read in the story that after his time of serving was over, he travels back home. And so that's what's happening here is he was taken he went from his home for his regular time of service where he's there serving according to the requirements of what they were supposed to do. We read about this couple that they were both righteous, verse 6, in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord. So this was happening in Jerusalem, in the temple. And the problem, as we said, is there was this couple who wanted a child but couldn't have one. And I've said already that this is a story of how what they thought was a void, what they could have believed was unanswered prayer, was actually an opportunity for blessing. And we learn a very good lesson here already from them. Because even though it appeared that God wasn't going to give them the thing they were asking for, they didn't let that be a wedge between them and God. You see that? It says that they were righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord. They were at the end of their life. So when they were back younger, newly married, hoping for a child, finding out they can't have one, they could have let that become a wedge. Sometimes people do, right? Sometimes the thing that we're wanting, the thing that we're expecting, the thing that we're asking God for, and it seems like he's not, either maybe you're not hearing me or you're not giving me the thing I'm asking for. For some people, that can drive a wedge between them and God. And what we see is that it didn't. So even though it didn't appear that God was going to give them what they had prayed for, that did not drive a wedge between them and God. And what we learn is that we can't confuse the crisis for God's character. You can't view God's character through the lens of your crisis. Does that make sense? Because sometimes in life we can get so focused on a situation, an expectation, something that we're wanting, we're thinking that will happen, we're hoping will happen, we're praying for. We can start to view God through that lens. And we can't do that. We have to view God through the lens of his word, through the lens of Scripture, for who he truly is, and let that cast a light on what our circumstances are, instead of viewing God through the circumstances and letting that skew our understanding and our view of who God is. But isn't that how most people, before they come to Christ, view God? God must not be good because this happened to me, right? So many people just view God because of the way their circumstances go. And Zachariah and Elizabeth seem to have a faith that did not let them do that. So as we think through the setting a little more in verses 8 through 10, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that Zechariah would come into here. It happened, verse 8, that while he was performing his priestly service before God in the appointed order of his division, according to the custom of the priestly office, he was chosen by Lot. Lot was kind of like an ancient version of like dice. And so they would throw these to figure out who got to go in and do this. There were so many priests in each division, and there were 24 divisions. There were a lot of priests. And so this was not a thing that everybody would expect to be able to be the one who actually gets to go into the temple and offer the sacrifice. And so this may be something he was hoping for. This may be something others could have been like, oh man, I didn't get chosen. This was a once in a lifetime opportunity. And in this, we can see that it, no matter how life appears, so for him, maybe he was thinking exciting. Maybe he was thinking, whoa, that's just shocking, unexpected. He didn't think he would ever be the one chosen. Maybe we might look at that and just say, really? They're going to just leave that up to chance and roll of a dice? You shouldn't do that. But no matter how life appears to us, God is in control. The right man was in the temple at the right time on the right day, and God used it. God is in control no matter how life appears to us. Then all of a sudden we encounter scene 1 of this story. An angel shows up. So if you don't know what a table of incense is, it's a box about this tall, about waist height. It's about this wide, square on the top, and they would burn the incense on top, and it would rise up, as an aroma. You could smell it. It would smell good. So he's standing here burning this, and it says the angel showed up just to the side of the table of incense. So he's here doing his thing. He's like, yes, I got chosen. I got to do this. He's trying to worship God and offer this on behalf of the people. And then all of a sudden, an angel shows up. And you see his response is the right response. It's a very human response. He was afraid, right? You see, angels, sometimes we can have wrong understandings of what angels are. They're depicted all the time as like little babies with somehow little like dove wings or something. Or sometimes we think of angels as though it's a human who then comes back as an angel. Angels are none of those things. And angels in their raw form are fierce, terrifying. They have a lot of glory. And yet their glory pales in comparison to the greatness of our God. But it was enough to scare him, to leave him in a place of fear and to get his attention. Now, this angel tells us his name, Gabriel. And we've seen him other times in Scripture. And one time he shows up, appears like a human. And angels can do that as well. And in this case, he didn't. He showed up in his raw angelic form, full of glory. And all you have to do is read through the book of Luke. You don't have to get outside of that to see that's the natural, normal human response to an angel is fear. Because they are such glorious creatures in the way that God made them, that it's beyond our capacity to just recognize or grapple with. And this angel shows up. He appears to him standing just beside him. Zacharias was troubled. Fear gripped him. But the angel brings good news. The angel brings a message that should be one of joy and a message that Zechariah didn't believe. He says, your petition, God's heard your prayer. God's heard your prayer. Isn't that a good sentence to hear? Any of you waiting on God for something and really wish maybe an angel would show up or God would tell you that sentence today? Your prayer has been heard. Because God does hear our prayers. Even where this was taking place, I think, is on purpose to remind us of that. Because the table of incense was used to demonstrate the prayers of humans rising up to God. And that God thinks of them as a sweet-smelling good aroma. We even see that in the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, where one day the prayers of all the saints or holy ones will be released because he stores them up in a bottle, and it's a sweet-smelling aroma to our God. That is your prayer life. If you know God, that is how he thinks of your prayers, as a sweet-smelling aroma. And you may not know it now, but he hears everything you're asking him for if you are in Christ. He hears you. He understands your heart and your desires even better than you do. And he knows how to work things out in a way to answer those. And yeah, sometimes in a way that we wouldn't expect, as was the case for them. But God knows what he's doing. And in this, we see that the story of their life was not just about them, was it? God's beautifully interweaving the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth with the story of the redemption of his people. He's beautifully interweaving this with the story of how he keeps his promises. Because you see, the Old Testament ends with a reality where God confronts his people named Israel with the reality that they don't want him. They're not trusting him. They're not following him. And he says, I'm going to send someone, and this person will be a forerunner. He will go before the one who will come, who's the Messiah, who will set things right, who will restore the hearts of you guys to me, who will restore the hearts of children to their parents. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of restoration that their story gets to be a subplot in. Have you ever thought of your life that way? The story of your year or your life isn't just about you. You know that? God's interweaving each of our stories into his greater purpose. And we can't always see and understand what he's doing, but when he shows up, we have a choice. Zechariah was taken off guard and he didn't believe it at first. He didn't believe it at first. The angel was told him, you're going to give birth to a son, or Elizabeth will give birth to a son. You're supposed to name him John. You're going to have joy and gladness. Not only you guys, but all of Israel will, because this is going to be the one who will come in the spirit and strength of Elijah, who will be a prophet, who will prepare his people. That's going to be the role that he plays. And his response here is one of doubt. It's one of doubt. How will I know this for certain? How will I know this for certain? I want to read two quotes from a man named Darrell Bock, which help us here. First of all, God is tackling two requests at once. One of those requests is national, the nation of Israel. The other is personal for Zechariah and Elizabeth. A prayer that had long since been abandoned and all but forgotten. Sometimes God's answers to prayer come in surprising ways after a long time. You know how the Bible tells us to pray without ceasing? Literally, that means don't give up on it. Pray it through. Pray it through to the end. Because there are prayers, there are things we look to God for, and sometimes we forget to keep looking, don't we? This may have been one of those things for Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were past the age where it would ever happen, physically speaking. We can't have a child anymore. They gave up even asking for it. And yet God shows up with the answer, and Zechariah is like, whoa, that can't be right. But it was right. The second quote from Darrell Bock says, sometimes what most hinders our perception of what God is doing is our own expectation of what God should do or would do. Isn't that so true? We can just be caught in our own expectations of how we think life should go, of how we think a situation should go, of how we think God should answer a prayer request. We can get so caught up in those things. And Darrell Bock, I think, wisely says, sometimes that's the thing that hinders us most from being sensitive to what God's doing. We're going to end this series on the unexpected with some people who were ready. They were looking for this one who would come, for this prophet and then the Messiah. They were ready. They were waiting for it, and their longings were fulfilled. Zechariah, it's a story of a guy who was faithful. He was described as righteous, as keeping his way blameless before God. We might say in our day and age, he's a good Christian. But yet he wasn't looking with expectation, was he? He stopped trusting that God could do that. And yet God shows up and answers that prayer right in the midst of it. He could have thought through the story of Abraham and Sarah from Genesis 17, right? Could have. He could have thought through, okay, the angel's telling me, but put yourself in his shoes, all right? You're just blindsided by this. You're just there offering the incense. All of a sudden, an angel shows up. This is a hope he had probably given up on a long time ago. And maybe what he thought was, okay, I've asked God for a child. We haven't gotten one. We're past the age where we can. That probably is God saying no. Can you follow that logic? So maybe it wasn't him just saying, well, God can't answer it. Maybe he was taking that as God's answer, as many of us do sometimes. And that's a good thing. And so maybe even in this, he was trying to be faithful. And so we understand the prayer that the Father said when he came to Jesus, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief in this as well. And so he could have known the story of how God went to Abraham and Sarah ended up laughing at him and saying, you can't do that, God. Oops. Or how Abraham said, okay, you can do it, but do it through my other child, not through Sarah. Oops. You see, they had certain expectations that when God clearly told them what he was doing. You see how strong our pride can be as humans? Our just assumption that our perspective is right can be so strong that when God is very clearly sending an angel to stand right beside us and say, I'm going to give you what you've been asking for, No, you're not. Really? How can this be? We need to be ready. We need to be expecting that God can blow our minds sometimes. Do you serve that God? Do you serve the God of the unexpected who can come through in ways that you never thought? How many prayers have been abandoned by Christians because they just started to feel hopeless? Because they just started to feel like, well, I guess it's never going to change. I guess God's never going to come through for me in this. Maybe I'm just asking wrong. Maybe I don't know how to pray. Maybe God just doesn't hear. He's too busy with more important things. God hears your prayer, and he can surprise you. Now, the thing is, he might answer it in a way you will never, ever expect. And we need to be willing to have our perspectives challenged here. Zacharias also would have known the promises that God had made to prepare a way for Messiah and for the fulfillment of a future kingdom to Israel. He would have known those promises. And so I don't know that even his shock was about the fact that God was doing something. I think it was just that he was doing it with him and that he was doing it with them because they were too old. How can this even be? We're not the kind of people you would use, God. Yeah, we're faithful. We're doing our thing, but we're not that. We're too old. We're past the date where we should be effective for this kind of ministry. But God had other plans. And I love what it says about his wife Elizabeth in verse 25. This is the way the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked with favor upon me to take away my disgrace among men. She received it, didn't she? She received what God was doing. So Zechariah would have been, so he was, first of all, because of his doubt, there were some surprising consequences for that. His voice was taken away until what was promised would be fulfilled. In other words, until their child, John, would be born. And so Elizabeth is dealing with a husband who can't even talk. She just finds out she's what we would say, humanly speaking, way too old to have a child. She finds out she's going to have a child. Her husband can't even talk to her. She could have been feeling like, God, I was asking for this in my youth. I was asking for it when I started to get older. I waited for years. I've wept tears over this. I wanted it so badly, and you didn't answer. And now you're going to answer it in my old age? Is this some kind of a joke, God? But she didn't, did she? She didn't view God through the lens of her crisis. She viewed her crisis from the lens of who God is. And she saw his grace taking away her disgrace among men. It's a beautiful response, isn't it? This is a great response of what it really should be. So we can choose to recognize God's favor, even though it looks different than we might have expected. That's what she did. She chose to recognize God's answer to prayer, God's favor. She said, this is God's favor for me. The same thing that somebody else or in a different circumstance that any other woman in her situation could have looked at and like, really, God? This is the way you chose to answer it? But she saw the heart of her God. And she said, this is a God who's giving me grace to take away my disgrace. And she lived a story of thankfulness that we pick up on at verse 57. Now the time had come for Elizabeth to give birth, and she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had displayed great mercy toward her, and they were rejoicing with her. You know your friends hear the story you tell them? Is that right? What if the story she told her friends was, why did God do this? I don't want to wake up and I don't want to like feed the baby in the middle of the night. I'm too old for this. I can't handle this anymore. I'm not a young woman. We're not a young, my husband hasn't even been able to talk to me for the last 9 months. One of the most exciting things that's ever happened. Apparently, she was telling them a different story. They saw, it says in verse 58, a great display of mercy. And they gathered to celebrate with joy over this. This wasn't a thing of, oh boy, here comes the baby. They were ecstatic. They were rejoicing with great joy that God had mercy, that he heard her prayers, that no matter how long it takes between when you ask for something and when God answers it, the length isn't a sign of whether or not God heard. God isn't bound by our time, right? And so the same angel that came to Zechariah, whose name was Gabriel, right? He showed up other times in our Bibles. One of those times was to a man named Daniel. Daniel needed some wisdom in life. He was spending some time among a pagan culture. He was really confused about what God was doing and how God was keeping his promises. And so he did the right thing. And he asked God, give me wisdom, please. Help me understand what you're doing. He didn't get an answer the next day. He didn't get an answer in the next week. He didn't get an answer the next month. It took a long time. Gabriel showed up and said, I have your answer. Now, the thing with Daniel is he didn't give up asking. He kept asking daily for this. He kept seeking it until the angel showed up. But what we see in the book of Daniel with the story of how Gabriel interacted with him is that Gabriel was dispatched or sent by God on day one when Daniel asked. Isn't that interesting? God heard and answered actually on the first day, but Daniel didn't realize it until years later because there were things happening in the unseen world, the angelic realm, that he didn't understand, that we don't see. And Gabriel came and revealed that and said, I was delayed because I was fighting a spiritual battle. See, our battle is not against flesh and blood, is it? And these stories amazingly kind of pull back the curtain of the unseen world, and I think rightly leave us with a sense of, whoa, this is just amazing. That there's this whole other aspect to life in the unseen realm that we can't even begin to fathom yet. We can't even begin to understand. And we see that in this story as well. John is born. John is born. We saw Elizabeth's response. We saw the response of all of their family and friends. But we learned something else in this response, or in this story of when John was born. It's that God's plans are not derailed because we doubt. But we serve a God who can turn our doubt into praise and put us back in the game. I never liked being pulled out of a game when I played basketball in high school. I got pulled out sometimes. I had a problem with fouling too much. So I got pulled out sometimes. I didn't like being benched, but it helped me learn. It helped me learn how to control my body the way I was supposed to play the game the way I was supposed to. Zechariah, he was kind of benched a little bit, right? His voice was taken away for a while, and sometimes that's when we learn the most. We know that we need to sometimes take away the voices of everybody and everything around us and just shut off the news and put down our phones and just be with God and our Bibles. We know that. But you realize sometimes it's your own voice, your own perspective that just blinds you to what God's trying to do, and we just need our voices taken away. Have you ever thought, this is just a surprising response or consequence rather to just a moment that seems so normal. If an angel showed up to me and told me when I was way too old to have a kid that my wife was going to have a kid, I don't know how I would respond. I'd probably be like, really? And yet God holds Zechariah accountable for his doubt. But at the same time, it's a story of grace for Zechariah too. Because I don't know. I mean, if you were in his shoes, would you be kicking yourself for 9 months? Why didn't I just not say that? Why did I put my wife in a situation where I can't talk to her for 9 months? And by the way, when he came out of the temple, there would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people waiting for him to come out and give a blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you. That was the expected thing. And he came out quiet. Just mouth moving, right? Making motions. They couldn't hear a thing. Something happened. He could have been kicking himself saying, I let all them down. But God doesn't hold up this litany of you did this and 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 you did this. But yet in this, Zechariah learns his lesson, doesn't he? Just by God taking his voice away. And we find then this interaction where he's born, where he needs to be named. He wasn't given a name yet. And Elizabeth said his name is John, and everybody else around is like, no, that's not right. Because you always, in their custom, they would have thought, you always name a child either after their father, their grandfather, or maybe if you're really one of those like edgy out there people, a cousin or an aunt or uncle. But it's always family. And they're like, this just doesn't make sense. You have no relative by that name. And so they motion to John. And in one moment and one seemingly little thing, we see a big act of faith. He writes, his name is John on a tablet. Not an iPad, not that kind of tablet. A physical tablet. He writes, his name is John. Immediately his mouth is restored. His lips are loosened. He can speak. And the first thing that comes out of his mouth is praise. And what we see in the rest of this chapter is one of the most amazing, just truth-filled stories or songs or times of worship that's just full of him talking about how God would accomplish things on behalf of his people. It's a story of redemption, salvation, forgiveness, how God is faithful to the things that he communicated to humans through prophets, how God keeps his covenants, how God keeps his oath to Abraham, how it really is summed up in verse 77, how he understood that God was doing something that's about salvation, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of sins, or by the forgiveness of sins. And so we're left in verse 65 with a statement that says, fear came on all those living around them. And all these matters were being talked about in all the hill country of Judea. Small verse, but a big statement, right? Fear came on all those. In a sense, this is a spectacular story, isn't it? In another sense, there's some very regular things here. She gave birth to a child. He wrote, his name is John. What did they do that was that spectacular, that would leave the whole hill country, everybody in that whole region, with fear, a recognition that God was doing something? First of all, an angel showed up. The guy went in with a voice and he came out. God did something. Second of all, they seemed to bear witness that what the angel told them was the fulfillment of promises from years gone by to a whole people, to restore something to them and to offer forgiveness. And somehow through all of this, they were just left with fear. Left with some kind of recognition that God is doing something. And they wondered, who's this boy going to turn out to be? Would you wonder the same thing? If that's the way he was born, who is this boy going to turn out to be? And he was described even by Gabriel as one who would be great. And he was described that way. This guy was one who people paid attention to. People came from all over to hear his preaching. Now, there was one in particular, Herod's wife, who hated his preaching, and he was beheaded because of that at the end of his life. But this was a man who had a powerful ministry, who people flocked, even the Pharisees and all of those who would be against all that and fought Jesus his whole life, just flocked to John. He had a very powerful ministry. They loved to hear his preaching. He was filled with the Spirit. Why? Because John was that great? Because when he was born, his parents were the best parents in the world? Doesn't say that. Just simply says, even in the womb, he was filled with the Holy Spirit and set apart for a unique role. Maybe your role and my role isn't the role of John the Baptist, and it's not. But what is your role? What is my role? Maybe your role and my role isn't the role of Zachariah or Elizabeth, but what is your role? And how do you respond when God does the unexpected things? Is what the others in your circle, in your family circle or friends, is what they hear in how you respond? Does it tell them that God is a great God full of grace, truth? Or does it tell them that you're just miserable because of the circumstances? Because the way we respond does matter. And we too, like them, can learn to worship God in the waiting. They waited a long time for the answer to that prayer, didn't they? Israel, some people from Israel, there was always a remnant, some people for over 400 years who regularly, daily were praying, God, please fulfill your promises. I know the rest of the nation is messed up and doesn't want you, but we do. How long, God? How long will you let this chaos abound around us? Will you worship in the waiting? Will you worship in the waiting and be ready for God to do things, not just in the way that you expect him to? Always in a way that fits with his character, yes, and with his word, but not with your expectations. Those aren't the guide. Just too often we assume they are without even realizing it. That our own perspective, our own expectations are the standard? No, they're not. How will we respond? Will we be like Elizabeth and just say, God, this is your grace. What I thought was a great void in my life was actually an opportunity for blessing, and I don't know how you're going to use it, but I trust you, and I'll worship you while I'm waiting. Or do we give up hope and stop asking and stop waiting? We're going to end this morning with a song that reaffirms that we should keep waiting. Wait on the Lord. So singers, if you can go ahead on, come up. We're going to sing a song, and then we'll close in prayer. So let's sing together.